Agnes Mary Clerk by Margaret Lindsay Huggins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Agnes Mary Clerk was born on February 10th, 1842, at Skibbereen, a small country town in a remote part of the County Cork. Her father was John William Kirk, and her mother was a sister of the late Lord Justice Deasy. Constitutionally delicate, Agnes Clerk from her earliest years, as so often is to be noticed in cases of frail health, found her chief delight in literary study and in music. From quiet talks often enjoyed with her in her later life, it was clear that her thoughtfulness and her liking for probing difficult problems must have developed early. In 1861 the Clerk family moved to Dublin, and in 1863 to Queenstown. The winters of 1867 and of 1868 were spent at Rome, that of 1871 at Naples, and the next 5 winters at Florence, the summers of 1874 to 76 being passed at the Bagna di Lucca. The sisters, Agnes and Ellen, both profited from this sojourn in Italy, as their subsequent writings show. But Agnes at Florence worked especially hard, reading constantly in the public library there, and always, I believe, with one great object before her. It is a question of much interest to examine into the early leanings and aspirations of those who distinguished themselves later, and Agnes Clerk early determined her life work. Before leaving Skibbereen at about the age of 15, she had clearly before her the intention of writing a history of astronomy, and it is thought had actually written a few chapters. Her first article in the Edinburgh Review is in harmony with the above facts. Agnes Clerk's literary life may be said to have begun in 1877 with the acceptance of her article Copernicus in Italy by Henry Reeve, then editor of the Edinburgh Review, who recognised the value of his new contributor and kept her at work. The number of her contributions to the Edinburgh is 55, and they are all of the highest order. Agnes Clerk with her family returned to England in 1877 and settled in London. With the publication of the History of Astronomy in 1885 may be said to have begun her astronomical life. She read systematically, and cultivated personal relations with a wide circle of astronomical workers, in person or by correspondence. I consider that these relations had much to do with the success of her work. Her sympathies were so keen, her interest so warm, her longing for further truth so intense, that everyone liked to offer her all he could. In 1890 appeared her second book, The System of the Stars. The progress of science and the growth of its literature during the last quarter of a century have been so enormous that a new order of worker is imperatively called for, and Agnes Clerk was an admirable example of such a worker, devoting her life to astronomy, which is at once the oldest and, in its new developments, the youngest of the sciences, the science which Poincaré has lately so eloquently declared to have given the conception of law to all others. The mission of these special workers is to collect, collate, correlate and digest the mass of observations and papers, to chronicle in short on one hand, and on the other to discuss and suggest, and to expound, that is, to prepare material for experts, to inform and interest the general public. There is an urgent need of a better educated public opinion in this country. That such a mission may be a splendid and fruitful one has been shown by Agnes Clerk. What careful preparation it requires, and how much it demands of those who would enter upon it, her career also shows. The immense increase in astronomical literature is hardly realised except by those engaged in dealing with it. To give but one instance, the annual index of astronomical literature for 1905, published under the auspices of the Astronomische Gesellschaft, contains over 2,000 references collated from 300 separate publications. The strain of such work as I am indicating is great indeed, involving as it should the power of holding loose in the mind, so to speak, an immense mass of facts, and also a power of rapidly associating or dissociating them as work and discovery may suggest. In one of her latest works, Modern Cosmogonies, Agnes Clerk herself dwelt upon this strain. Year by year, she says, page 160, details accumulate, and the strain of keeping them under mental command becomes heavier. Pathetic words, written almost in blood, for not long before had been published her last large work, Problems in Astrophysics, a work she feared she could not live to complete, a work which she was able to toil at for only half an hour at a time. All through her life Agnes Clerk was a student. Lectures and Friday evening discourses at the Royal Institution, which bore upon her work, she was careful to attend. A 3 months' visit to Sir David and Lady Gill at the Cape in 1888 gave her some observatory opportunities, which increased her power of clearly realizing the records of observatory and laboratory work. She was awarded by the Royal Institution in 1892 the Actonian Prize of 100 guineas for her works on astronomy, and in 1903 she received the distinction of being elected an honorary member of the Royal Astronomical Society, an honour and title held previously only by Mrs. Somerville, Caroline Herschel, and Anne Sheepshanks. A frequent attendant at the meetings of both the Royal Astronomical Society and the British Astronomical Association, she was always an interested one. Occasionally she spoke, but she had no liking for speaking in public, nor indeed was she well suited for it. A complete list of Agnes Clerk's papers it would be difficult to compile. They were in truth innumerable. Her articles on astronomers for the Dictionary of National Biography, articles for the Encyclopaedia Britannica and for other encyclopedias, were many, and all of them were models of painstaking inquiry and of clear, concise statement. The more important of these are of lasting interest and value. Her larger works are History of Astronomy in the 19th Century, 4 editions, The System of the Stars, 2 editions, Familiar Studies in Homer, The Herschels and Modern Astronomy, Concise History of Astronomy, Modern Cosmogonies, Problems in Astrophysics. I venture to think that the history of astronomy in the 19th century is the most important of her works. It is admirable in its completeness of references, its wide inclusiveness, and in its lucidity. It deserves to live, and assuredly will live, the invaluable continuation of Grant's fine work. The Systems of the Stars and The Problems in Astrophysics are works of a different order. Treasuries of knowledge and of suggestion they certainly are. The Homeric studies, except in one chapter, are not specially astronomical, but they are evidence of a breadth of culture and of wide intellectual interest, and are full of delightful touches of wit and of humour. It seems to me a mistake to regard Agnes Clerk's smaller works as of less importance than her larger ones. I have said that I consider the history her greatest work, but in some respects I venture to think that her greatest achievement is Modern Cosmogonies. I claim for this book that it is not only a history, but a work of philosophical thinking and of imaginative insight of a very high order. Its small size is an accident. It is a work essentially great. In these brilliant sketches, Agnes Clerk's style is at its best. But the writing in Modern Cosmogonies, good as it is a small matter compared with the masterly grasp of, I may say, all things and of their interrelations which the work reveals. and where else is shown, in recent philosophical writing, such vision and faculty divine for seizing and pointing out the reasonable spiritual clues set in what we call nature, clues helping us to sustainment of soul in the midst of the majestic mysteries surrounding us. No sketch of Agnes Clerk would be complete without reference to her love of music. To her, music was in the highest sense of the term a recreation. She turned to it for very life. Her piano playing was truly musicianly, and her repertory was large. Perhaps her playing was at its best in rendering Chopin. As an accompanist she excelled. Her teachers were, in Dublin, Miss Flynn, in Florence, Buonamici. Remarkable as were the intellectual powers of Agnes Clerk, her moral endowments were equally so. It was a question we frequently debated, the influence of character on work, and as I write, the memory of certain talks is hauntingly present. As is the heart, is the work. The best work is, and must be associated with lofty character. It was so with Agnes Clerk. No purer, loftier, and yet more sweetly unselfish and human soul has lived. She was so incapable of meanness, that she even incurred danger as a historian in crediting too readily all workers with her own high ideals. As a friend and companion she was faithful and true, and full of charm, and without her the world to those who had her friendship seems darkened and empty. But her mission, I believe, has been fulfilled. For 20 years she has been to modern astronomy an admirable historian, and has kept before working astronomers clear charts, so to speak, of what was being done, and of what should and might be done. In so doing she rendered splendid service, and inaugurated a kind of work which must be more and more needed, a kind of work which not only advances astronomy, but promotes a universal brotherhood and cooperation, golden indeed. Agnes Clerk's death comes as a shock to many. A cold, I fear not sufficiently nursed at first, led to pneumonia and complications, and, in spite of all that devoted love and skill could do, she passed gently to the next life, peaceful and fully conscious almost to the last, on the morning of January 20th, 1907. End of Agnes Mary Clerk by Margaret Lindsay Huggins. Read by Melanie T.
Brief Account of the English Character by Charles Marjoribanks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brief Account of the English Character by Charles Marjoribanks. From the Canton Register, July 18, 1832. The English people inhabit a country at the distance of 16,000 miles from China. At least this space is passed over by ships, from the necessity of their proceeding round the southern continent of Africa. Some idea may be formed of the spirit and enterprise of a nation whose vessels traverse so vast an ocean in safety and with facility. They frequently encounter severe tempests, but from the skill of their officers and the bold and daring character of the seamen, ships are rarely lost. Pirates or enemies do not venture to attack them. They bring the manufactures and productions of remote countries, and receive in exchange those of China. By this means the subjects, both of the Chinese and British empires, are enriched, industry is greatly encouraged, and men are rendered happy and useful members of society. The English have traded for upwards of 200 years with China, and from 60 to 80 vessels under the English flag are frequently within 12 months in the Chinese waters. To how many tens of thousands of natives does not such a commerce give useful employment? The policy of the English government has often in China been most falsely represented, and it has been stated to be ambitious and desirous of increase of territory. No assertion can be more distant from truth. The dominions of England are already so large that the policy of the government is rather to diminish than to enlarge them. Besides the mother country, it has several valuable possessions in Europe. It has large territories in North America and numerous islands in the West Indies. The Cape of Good Hope, in Africa, belongs to it. It has several prosperous settlements in Australia. Numerous islands in Asia are subject to its rule, and the ancient territory of Hindustan, with all the regions pertaining thereto, is now included in the British Empire. The small settlements of Penang, Martaban, Malacca, and Singapore are those most contiguous to China. The government of so great an empire has no thirst for conquest. Its great object and aim is to preserve its subjects in a condition of happiness and tranquillity. But while most desirous of doing so, it is very jealous of insult and ever ready to avenge oppression and injustice. The object and endeavour of the English in China have always been to carry on a pacific and amicable intercourse, but their anxiety to do so has, on several occasions, been frustrated. The benevolent disposition of the great Emperor of China has induced him to state his desire to treat remote foreigners with indulgence and consideration, but the imperial benevolence of mind has, on several occasions in past years, been opposed by subordinated officers of his government. Foreigners trading to Canton have been heavily taxed and oppressed, and commerce has been greatly impeded by the exactions to which it has been exposed. Natives have repeatedly been heavily fined and punished, sometimes cruelly tortured and put to death, for alleged treasonable connection with the English, whose only object was to conduct a commercial intercourse in tranquillity, and to obey the imperial laws. In addition to the government duties, large sums of money have been forced from native merchants, and bribes have been received by inferior officers. Both natives and foreigners have been subject to these oppressions. The imperial ear is too remote that even the echo of such things should be heard, for they are often done in darkness and silence, but the great and enlarged mind of the emperor can never approve of such acts on the part of his servants. Printed placards have been affixed to the walls of public buildings, traducing the foreign character and encouraging low and degraded natives to insult strangers who resort to China. Affrays and riots have frequently in consequence taken place, the public peace has been disturbed, and commercial intercourse interrupted. How much are the police officers to blame who do not put an end to such improper and unjust proceedings? English sailors are often rude in manner, though kind in disposition. They cannot bear insult, hence riots take place, wounds are inflicted, and death is sometimes the consequence. On board English ships that resort to China, strict discipline is preserved, and the men are immediately punished if they commit violent acts towards natives or others. But discipline is of little avail if low natives are encouraged by low officers to insult and attack them. The laws of England make no distinction of persons, and an Englishman is as severely punished for an act of violence towards a Chinese as he is for one towards a fellow countryman. The manners and customs of all nations are different. With just allowance made for such difference, why should not Chinese and Englishmen live together on terms of friendly cordiality? The commands of the sovereign of England to his subjects are, wherever they go in the world, to endeavour to maintain an amicable and pacific intercourse with the people of the country, but never to be forgetful of their national name or honour. When Chinese subjects arrive in England or in any other part of the English dominions, they live under the protection of the laws, which are equally administered to them with the natives of the country. Their wrongs and injuries are all equally redressed. Instead, then, of being encouraged to acts of enmity towards each other, why should not English and Chinese strive together, which should most excel in acts of beneficence and kindness? In many instances, natives of China, who have been found shipwrecked on barren islands in the midst of the boisterous ocean, have been saved by the crews of English vessels, unfortunate men who must otherwise have perished in want and misery. British sailors have long been distinguished for such acts of humanity, and are taught to glory in them, more than even in deeds of war. Yet these are the persons whom the natives of China are sometimes told, by designing men, to insult and despise. The people of China are highly intelligent, industrious, and prosperous, but they are not the only people in the world that are so. Ignorant men have sometimes foolishly taught that all that is good is centered in China, but that the rest of the earth is worthless. How vain and childish is the man who reasons thus! If he had visited other countries, he would have discovered that heaven had in its bounty and mercy bestowed manifold blessings on many other regions of the earth. In England the people live in tranquillity. Their persons and property are protected by the laws. Their religion inculcates peace upon earth and goodwill towards all men. They have arrived at a wonderful state of improvements in art and science, and in the cultivation of all those means which serve to civilize mankind. They are feared in times of war, and honored in times of peace. There is no country with which it is more the interest of China to remain on terms of friendly intercourse than England. It carries on a great and lucrative commerce with this empire, and the confines of its Indian dominions almost border upon those of China. One river which rises in Yunnan flows through a portion of the British territory. It is much to the honor of Chinese merchants that they are strict and accurate in their commercial dealings, and in some instances have shown acts of much liberality to foreigners. The pride of a British merchant is to be just and liberal in his dealings. The high name and reputation of the English East India Company in China has long been established. The promise of its servants is as good as money accurately weighed, and its faith pledged in any mercantile transaction has never once been broken. Let the people of China think profoundly upon these things, and not treat lightly persons of this stamp and character. Let the officers of government, in accordance with the decrees of the benevolent Emperor of China, treat foreigners with the respect and consideration to which they are entitled. Then, indeed, will there be peace, union, and harmony between the native and British community in China. A friend to China and England, whose anxious desire is the happiness of his fellow men, traces with a feeble pen this hasty and imperfect sketch. End of Brief Account of the English Character, by Charles Marjoribanks. Read by Avai.
By the Road, Parts 1 and 2, by William Somerset Maugham. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. By the Road, 1 and 2, by William Somerset Maugham. The approach to Carmona is a very broad, white street, much too wide for the cottages which line it, deserted, and the young trees planted on either side are too small to give shade. The sun beat down with a fierce glare, and the dust rose in clouds as I passed. Presently I came to a great Moorish gateway, a dark mass of stone, battlemented, with a lofty horseshoe arch. People were gathered about it in many-colored groups. I found it was a holiday in Carmona, and the animation was unwonted. In a corner stood the hut of the consumo, and the men advanced to examine my saddlebags. I passed through into the town, looking right and left for a parador, an hostelry whereat to leave my horse. I bargained for the price of food, and saw Aguador comfortably stalled, then made my way to the necropolis where lived my host. There are many churches in Carmona, and into one of these I entered. It had nothing of great interest, but to a certain degree It was rich, rich in its gilded woodwork and in the brocade that adorned the pillars. And I felt that these Spanish churches lent a certain dignity to life. For all the careless flippancy of Andalusia, they still remained to strike a nobler note. I forgot willingly that the land was priest-ridden and superstitious, so that a Spaniard could tell me bitterly that there were but two professions open to his countrymen, the priesthood and the bull-ring. It was pleasant to rest in that cool and fragrant darkness. My host was an archaeologist, and we ate surrounded by broken earthenware, fragmentary mosaics, and grinning skulls. It was curious afterwards to wander in the graveyard which, with indefatigable zeal, he had excavated among the tombs of forgotten races, letting one's self down to explore the subterranean cells. The paths he had made in the giant cemetery were lined with a vast number of square sandstone boxes which had contained human ashes. And now, when the lid was lifted, a green lizard or a scorpion darted out. From the hill I saw stretched before me the great valley of the Guadalquivir, with the squares of olive and ploughed field, and the various greens of the corn. It was like a vast, multicolored carpet. But later, with the sunset, black clouds arose, splendidly piled upon one another, and the twilight air was chill and grey. A certain sternness came over the olive groves, and they might well have served as a reproach to the facile Andaluz, for their cold, passionless green seemed to offer a warning to his folly. At night my host left me to sleep in the village, and I lay in bed alone in the little house among the tombs. It was very silent. The wind sprang up and blew about me, whistling through the windows, whistling weirdly, and I felt as though the multitudes that had been buried in that old cemetery filled the air with their serried numbers, a vast, silent congregation, waiting motionless for they knew not what. I recalled a gruesome fact that my friend had told me. Not far from there, in tombs that he had disinterred, the skeletons lay huddled spasmodically, with broken skulls and a great stone by the side. For when a man, he said, lay sick unto death, his people took him and placed him in his grave, and with the stone killed him. In the morning I set out again. It was 35 miles to Asija, but a new high road stretched from place to place, and I expected easy riding. Carmona stands on the top of a precipitous hill, round which winds the beginning of the road below. After many zigzags I saw its continuation, a straight white line reaching as far as I could see. In Andalusia, till a few years ago, there were practically no high roads, and even now there are few and bad. The chief communication from town to town is usually an uneven track, which none attempts to keep up, with deep ruts, and palmetto growing on either side, and occasional pools of water. A day's rain makes it a quagmire, impassable for anything beside the sure-footed mule. I went on, meeting now and then a string of asses, their panniers filled with stones or with wood for Carmona. The driver sat on the rump of the hindmost animal, for that is the only comfortable way to ride a donkey. A peasant trotted briskly by on his mule, his wife behind him with her arms about his waist. I saw a row of ploughs in a field. To each were attached 2 oxen, and they went along heavily, one behind the other, in regular line. By the side of every pair a man walked bearing a long goad, and one of them sang a malagueña, its monotonous notes rising and falling slowly. From time to time I passed a white farm, a little way from the road, invitingly cool in the heat. The sun began to beat down fiercely. The inevitable storks were perched on a chimney, by their big nest, and when they flew in front of me, with their broad white wings, and their red legs against the blue sky, they gave a quaint impression of a Japanese scream. A farmhouse such as this seems to me always a type of the Spanish impenetrability. I have been over many of them, and know the manner of their rooms and the furniture, the round of duties there performed and how the day is portioned out, but the real life of the inhabitants escapes me. My knowledge is merely external. I am conscious that it is the same of the Andalusians generally, and am dismayed because I know practically nothing more after a good many years than I learnt in the first months of my acquaintance with them. Below the superficial similarity with the rest of Europe, which of late they have acquired, there is a difference which makes it impossible to get at the bottom of their hearts. They have no openness as have the French and the Italians, with whom a good deal of intimacy is possible even to an Englishman, but on the contrary an Eastern reserve which continually baffles me. I cannot realize their thoughts nor their outlook. I feel always below the grace of their behaviour, the instinctive, primeval hatred of the stranger. Gradually the cultivation ceased, and I saw no further sign of human beings. I returned to the desert of the previous day, but the land was more dreary. The little groves of pine trees had disappeared. There were no olives, no cornfields, not even the aloe, nor the wilder cactus. But on either side, as far as the horizon, desert wastes, littered with stones, and with rough boulders, grown over only by palmetto. For many miles I went, dismounting now and then to stretch my legs and sauntering a while with the reins over my shoulder. Towards midday I rested by the wayside and let Aguador eat what grass he could. Presently, continuing my journey, I caught sight of a little hovel where the fir branch over the door told me wine was to be obtained. I fastened my horse to a ring in the wall, and, going in, found an aged crone, who gave me a glass of that thin white wine, produce of the last year's vintage, which is called vino de la hoja, wine of the leaf. She looked at me incuriously as though she saw so many people and they were so much alike that none repaid particular scrutiny. I tried to talk with her, for it seemed a curious life that she must lead, alone in that hut many miles from the nearest hamlet, with never a house in sight. But she was taciturn, and eyed me now with something like suspicion. I asked for food, but with a sullen frown she answered that she had none to spare. I inquired the distance to Louisiana, a village on the way to Estica, where I had proposed to lunch, and, shrugging her shoulders, she replied, "How should I know?" I was about to go, when I heard a great clattering, and a horseman galloped up. He dismounted and walked in, a fine example of the Andalusian countryman, handsome and tall, well shaved, with close cropped hair. He wore elaborately decorated gaiters, the usual short, close-fitting jacket, and a broad-brimmed hat. In his belt were a knife and a revolver, and slung across his back a long gun. He would have made an admirable brigand of comic opera, but was in point of fact a farmer riding, as he told me, to see his novia, or lady love, at a neighbouring farm. I found him more communicative, and in the politest fashion we discussed the weather and the crops. He had been to Seville. "Che maravilla!" he cried, waving his fine, strong hands. "What a marvel! But I cannot bear the townfolk. What thieves and liars!" "Townfolk should stick to the towns," muttered the old woman, looking at me somewhat pointedly. The remark drew the farmer's attention more closely to me. "And what are you doing here?" he asked. "Riding to Écija." "Ah, you're a commercial traveller!" he cried, with fine scorn. "You foreigners bleed the country of all its money. You and the government." "Rogues and vagabonds!" muttered the old woman. Notwithstanding, the farmer, with much condescension, accepted one of my cigars, and made me drink with him a glass of aguardiente. We went off together. The mare he rode was really magnificent, rather large, holding her head beautifully, with a tail that almost swept the ground. She carried as if it were nothing the heavy Spanish saddle, covered with a white sheepskin, its high triangular pommel of polished wood. Our ways, however, quickly diverged. I inquired again how far it was to the nearest village. "Eh," said the farmer, with a vague gesture. "2 leagues, 3 leagues. Quien sabe? Who knows? Adios!" He put the spurs to his mare and galloped down a bridle track. I, whom no fair maiden awaited, trotted on soberly. By the road. Part II. The endless desert grew rocky and less sandy, the colors duller. Even the palmetto found scanty sustenance, and huge boulders, strewn as through some vast torrent, had passed through the plain, alone broke the desolate flatness. The dusty road pursued its way, invariably straight, neither turning to one side nor to the other, but continually in front of me, a long white line. Finally, in the distance, I saw a group of white buildings and a cluster of trees. I thought it was Louisiana, but Louisiana, they had said, was a populous hamlet, and here were only 2 or 3 houses and not a soul. I rode up and found among the trees a tall white church, and a pool of murky water. Further back a low, new edifice, which was evidently a monastery, and a posada. Presently a Franciscan monk, in his brown cowl, came out of the church, and he told me that Louisiana was a full league off, but that food could be obtained at the neighbouring inn. The posada was merely a long barn, with an open roof of wood, on one side of which were half a dozen mangers, and in a corner 2 mules. Against another wall were rough benches for travellers to sleep on. I dismounted and walked to the huge fireplace at one end, where I saw 3 very old women, seated like witches round a brasero, the great brass dish of burning cinders. With true Spanish stolidity, they did not rise as I approached, but waited for me to speak, looking at me indifferently. I asked whether I could have anything to eat. "Fried eggs." "Anything else?" The hostess, a tall creature, haggard and grim, shrugged her shoulders. Her jaws were toothless, and when she spoke it was difficult to understand. I tied Aguador to a manger, and took off his saddle. The old women stirred themselves at last, and one brought a portion of chopped straw and a little barley. Another with the bellows blew on the cinders, and the third, taking eggs from a basket, fried them on the brasero. Besides, they gave me coarse brown bread and red wine, which was coarser still. For dessert, the hostess went to the door and from a neighbouring tree plucked oranges. When I had finished, it was not a very substantial meal. I drew my chair to the brasero and handed round my cigarette case. The old women helped themselves, and a smile of thanks made the face of my gaunt hostess somewhat less repellent. We smoked a while in silence. "Are you all alone here?" I asked at length. The hostess made a movement of her head towards the country. "My son is out shooting," she said, "and 2 others are in Cuba, fighting the rebels." "God protect them!" muttered another. "All our sons go to Cuba now," said the first. "Oh, I don't blame the Cubans, but the government." An angry light filled her eyes, and she lifted her clenched hand, cursing the rulers at Madrid who took her children. "They're robbers and fools. Why can't they let Cuba go? It isn't worth the money we pay in taxes." She spoke so vehemently, mumbling the words between her toothless gums, that I could scarcely make them out. "In Madrid they don't care if the country goes to rack and ruin so long as they fill their purses. Listen." She put one hand on my arm. "My boy came back with fever and dysentery. He was ill for months, at death's door, and I nursed him day and night. And almost before he could walk they sent him out again to that accursed country." The tears rolled heavily down her wrinkled cheeks. Louisiana is a curious place. It was a colony formed by Charles III. of Spain with Germans, whom he brought to people the desolate land; and I fancy the Teuton ancestry was apparent in the smaller civility of the inhabitants. They looked sullenly as I passed, and none gave the friendly Andalusian greeting. I saw a woman hanging clothes on the line outside her house. She had blue eyes and flaxen hair, a healthy red face, and a solidity of build which proved the purity of her northern blood. The houses, too, had a certain exotic quaintness, notwithstanding the universal whitewash of the South. There was about them still a northern character. They were prim and regularly built, with little plots of garden. The fences and the shutters were bright green. I almost expected to see German words on the post office and on the tobacco shop, and the grandiloquent Spanish seemed out of place. I thought the Spanish clothes of the men sat upon them uneasily. The day was drawing to a close, and I pushed on to reach Asilla before night, but Aguador was tired, and I was obliged mostly to walk. Now the highway turned and twisted among little hills, and it was a strange relief to leave the dead level of the plains. On each side the land was barren and desolate, and in the distance were dark mountains. The sky had clouded over, and the evening was grey and very cold. The solitude was awful. At last I overtook a peddler plodding along by his donkey, the panniers filled to overflowing with china and glass, which he was taking to sell in Asilla. He wished to talk, but he was going too slowly, and I left him. I had hills to climb now, and at the top of each expected to see the town, but every time was disappointed. The traces of man surrounded me at last. Again I rode among olive groves and cornfields. The highway now was bordered with straggling aloes and with hedges of cactus. At last! I reached the brink of another hill, and then, absolutely at my feet, so that I could have thrown a stone on its roof, lay Asija, with its numberless steeples. End of By the Road, Parts 1 and 2, by William Somerset Maugham.
The Donkey by Anna Botsford Comstock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How interesting it would be if we could see the ancestors of our pet donkey for 6,000 years back, all standing in a row with a picture behind each showing in what country it had lived, and what sort of master it had had, and what sort of work it did. It might require years to take in such a show, and probably the ancestor at the far end of the line would be found to be a wild, fleet animal of northeastern Africa, maybe one of a herd feeding on an oasis in the Sahara, or grazing on the scanty vegetation of desert mountains. From this wild African species our donkeys of today are supposed to have originated. However, there are wild species found in Persia and Syria, and one in Tibet, and one in northwestern India, and perhaps our especial donkey may have come from some of these. To this day, herds of wild asses roam Persia and Armenia as they did in the times of Abraham, or when Xenophon described them 400 years BC. These wild creatures can run so swiftly that Nadir Shah, who lived 200 years ago, considered that running down one of these wild creatures with greyhounds was equal in effort to winning a battle or conquering a province. Its flesh was regarded as superior to the best venison, and its hide was made into ornamental shagreen and other valuable leather entirely waterproof. There are pictures of donkeys in the tombs of ancient Thebes, which are an excellent likeness of the little animals that today bear the burdens for the farmers along the Nile. George Washington introduced donkeys to the agriculturists of the United States. Spain had long been in the lead in breeding these animals, and to export one from that country was prohibited. But the King of Spain, learning of Washington's desire, sent him two as a present. The donkey is used extensively today in the southwestern United States and Mexico, where its strength and endurance as a beast of burden make it most useful. It is there called a burro. Donkeys are used extensively in southern Europe, North Africa, and Asia Minor. The best breeds are now found in Smyrna, the island of Cyprus, Spain, and Peru. The donkey is able to thrive upon food which would starve a horse. It can subsist on 1/4 of the food necessary to keep a horse, and it can carry burdens on its back for long distances which would break down a horse, and it carries these burdens over steep mountains and roads where a horse would stumble and fall. Its hoof is longer and narrower and more upright than that of a horse, and the joint above it, called the pastern, is shorter and stiffer, which renders its feet less likely to become lame, and since the hoof is thicker and therefore tougher than that of a horse, it is able to climb mountains and rocky trails which would tear and bruise the horse's feet. The donkey is a friend of the poor man, because it can pick up a living at little expense. When treated well, it is as affectionate as a dog. The mother donkey is exceedingly fond of her colt. The noted obstinance of the animal comes probably from long generations of cruel treatment. It is an assertion of the creature's natural strength and dignity which have not been crushed out through thousands of years of abuse. For defence, the donkey can both bite and kick. As a kicker it is most efficient, for it can bear its weight upon its front feet and kick with both hind legs, aiming just where each hoof shall strike with wonderful accuracy and precision. The colour of the donkey should be a mouse grey, with a dark line along the backbone and a dark transverse bar across the shoulders. For housing and feeding the donkey, follow the directions given for caring for the pony. It should be kept warmer than a pony in winter, for it suffers much with cold in our northern climate. End of The Donkey by Anna Botsford Comstock. Read by Melanie T.
Down Among the Dead Letters, a chapter from Overland Tales by Josephine Clifford. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Strangers visiting Washington and admiring the style and architecture of the General Post Office building would never know that there are numbers of ladies seated behind the plate glass of the second-story windows. Indeed, few people residing in the Capitol are really aware in what part of the building those female clerks are stowed away. I had passed on every side of the building, morning, noon, and night, but never had seen anybody that looked like a female clerk till I found myself of their number one morning. And then I discovered the right entrance to the Dead Letter Office. It is on F Street, so close to the ladies' delivery that any person entering here would be supposed to be inquiring for a letter at that delivery. There is another entrance on E Street, but it is not much patronized by the ladies until after 15 minutes past 9 o'clock, for punctually at that time the doorkeeper is instructed to lock the ladies' door on F Street, and those who are tardy are compelled to go up the gentlemen's staircase or pass in at the large public entrance on E Street. Crowds of visitors walk through the building day after day, but not one of the ladies employed here do they see unless they request to be shown the rooms of the female employees. In this department, working hours are from 9 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Ladies are not allowed to leave the office for lunch, nor do they waste much time in discussing the lunch they may have brought, as it is only in consideration of their industry and close application that they are allowed to leave the office at 3 o'clock instead of 4. The Dead Letter Office is one of the most complicated pieces of machinery in the ship of state. I will try to explain and elucidate as much of it as came under my observation. Letters left uncalled for at the different post offices throughout the country are sent to the Dead Letter Office after a certain length of time. Letters not prepaid or short paid through neglect or ignorance of the writer also find their way here, and so do foreign letters from all parts of Europe, which have been prepaid only in part and therefore come here instead of reaching their destination. Sometimes mails are robbed and the mail bags hidden or thrown away, but are afterwards searched for and their remaining contents brought to this office. Then again, a vessel at sea, homeward bound, brings letters from ships meeting it, of sailors and passengers, who send their letters in firm faith that they will reach their anxious friends at home. But if our government happens to have no treaty or contract with that particular government to which the writer belongs, of course, the letters cannot be forwarded, but are laid at rest here. These letters are carefully preserved for a number of years. They are sometimes called for, and found a long, long time after they were written. In fact, only dead letters are destroyed. Though I wish to speak more particularly of the duties and labor performed by the ladies employed in this department, I must begin by saying that all letters pass through the hands of and are opened by a number of gentlemen, clerks in the department, whose room is on the ground floor of the building. A great number of letters contain money, valuable papers, and postage stamps. These are sent to the superintendent's room. Letters without contents are folded, with the envelope laid inside the letter, tied in bundles, and sent upstairs for directing. Money, drafts, and postage stamps, however, are not the only articles considered mailable matter by the public. One day I looked over a box filled with such matter, taken from dead letters and parcels in the opening room, and found in it one half-worn gaiter boot, 2 hairnets, a rag doll baby, minus the head and 1 foot, a set of cheap jewelry, a small-sized frying pan, 2 ambrotypes, 1 pair of white kid gloves, a nursing bottle, a toothbrush, a boot jack, 3 yards of lace, a box of Ayer's pills, a bunch of keys, 6 nutmegs, a toddy stick, and no end of dress samples. This matter is allowed to accumulate for 3 months, and is then sold at auction, but a register is so carefully kept that the person mailing the doll baby without prepaying can follow its progress from the little country town where it was mailed to the end of its career under the hammer at the dead letter office, and here can claim the amount it brought at auction. Every clerk, male or female, has his or her letter, from A to Z, and beginning again with AA when the alphabet runs out. Before the ladies take their places at the desk in the morning, the messenger has already placed there the number of envelopes each lady is expected to direct in the course of the day, and large baskets filled with bundles of letters sent up from the opening room, the bundles marked with the letter of the clerk through whose hands they have passed, are brought into the rooms. The envelopes are stamped in one corner with the lady's letter in red, so that the ladies are spoken of, by the superintendent or the messengers, as Miss A, B, C, D, not as Miss Miller or Mrs. Smith. 50 of these envelopes are contained in one package, so that it is easy to calculate whether any of them are wasted by misdirecting or blotting. The work looks simple enough when you see a number of ladies seated at their desks writing addresses on envelopes with the greatest apparent ease. And then, as a gushing young lady said to me one day, how romantic it must be to listen to the outpourings of love and affection that these letters must contain in many cases, and the dark secrets that others disclose. She thought it a rather cruel restraint when I told her we were allowed to read only so much of a letter as was necessary to discover the name of the writer, and to read no part of it if the name was signed clearly and distinctly at the end. Let the lady reader pause a moment and ask herself, do I sign my letters so that one of these clerks could return them from the dead letter office without going over the whole of their contents? By the time you have finished reading this paper, I hope you will form the resolution to sign your name in full, and just as it is, to every letter you send by mail. Don't sign your name Seda when it is really Sarah Jones in full, and if you call your father's brick house on 3rd Street Pine Grove because there are 2 dry pine trees in the front yard, don't neglect to add number 24 3rd Street, Cincinnati, Ohio. The greater number of letters passing through this office are badly written and uninteresting, many of them so perfectly unintelligible that no human being can read or return them. Not that the greater portion of our community are uneducated or unintelligent people, but that they are either reckless or careless. Letters directed with any kind of common sense are most always sure of reaching their destination without visiting the dead letter office. Not only do people, in a number of cases, neglect to prepay their letters, but frequently letters without direction or address of any kind are dropped into the letter boxes. In writing to individuals residing in the same city with them, people think it is necessary only to mention the name of the individual. The post office man is expected to know that the letter is not to go out of the city. The post office people are, if not omniscient, at least very obliging. I have found a letter directed to Carrollton in America, and the letter had been forwarded to and bore the postmark of every Carrollton in the United States before it was sent here. The work of the ladies falls under 2 heads, common and special. We will get the best idea of what common means in contradistinction to special by watching Miss A on common work this morning. Taking one of the bundles of letters from the basket, she opens it and takes up the top letter. Spreading it on the desk, she finds the envelope inside. It is directed to William Smith, Philadelphia, Penn, and the words "uncalled for" stamped on the envelope show why it was sent here. Now the signature is to be looked for. It is here, John Jones. Next, where was it dated? Somerville, Ohio. But does the postmark on the envelope correspond with that? Yes, it is postmarked from where it was dated, so John Jones will receive his letter back again. His friend W. Smith may have left Philadelphia, or may have died. John Jones' letter is returned to him in a coarse, brown P.O.D. envelope, stamped with the letter A in one corner, and he pays 3 cents for the privilege of knowing that his friend Smith never received his letter. The next is a delicate pink affair, dated White Rose Bower, signed Ella. Only this and nothing more. So the letter is hopelessly dead, and thrown into the paper basket at Miss A's side. The epistle following this is signed Henry Foster, and could be returned if it had not been dated at Whitehall and postmarked Harrisburg. On looking over the post office directory, we may or may not find a Whitehall in Pennsylvania, but there is nothing in the letter to show whether Henry Foster's home is in Harrisburg or Whitehall. Consequently, that letter is dead, too. Here is one, signed plainly and legibly, but the writer has omitted to date it from any particular place. From the tone of the letter, it is plainly to be seen that he lives where the letter was mailed. But where was it mailed? The postmark on the envelope is so indistinct that any lady not employed in the dead letter office would throw it aside as unreadable. But ladies here learn to decipher what to ordinary mortals would be hieroglyphic or simply a blank. After consulting the pages of the post office directory beside her, Miss A passes the envelope to Miss B. Can you suggest any post office in Indiana, beginning with M, ending with L, with about 4 letters between? Miss B scrutinizes the envelope closely. The postmark is not from Indiana, it is from Iowa, is her decision. Mrs. C, D, and E, at work in the same room, differ in opinion, and at last Miss A steps across the hall to the room of the lady superintendent, where a blue book is kept, and with the assistance of this lady and the book, Miss A discovers the place in Indiana, directs the letter, and continues her work. When she has directed 50 letters, she ties them, with both envelopes, the P.O.D. and original one, inside each letter, carefully together, and the messenger carries them into the folding room, where other ladies, employed in this branch, fold and seal them. Of these common letters, every lady is required to direct from 200 to 300 a day, a task by no means easy to accomplish. Special work is generally disliked by the ladies, and is of a somewhat mixed character. Letters held for postage, consequently not dead, come under this head. They, too, are sent back to the writer if the signature can be found, and the place from which they are dated corresponds with the postmark. If not, they are assorted according to letter and put away into pigeonholes, marked with the letter corresponding. Foreign letters, such as I spoke of before, come under this head, too. Then there are official letters, in relation to military and judicial matters, short paid, and therefore brought before this tribunal. These require minute attention, as 3 and 4 documents are enclosed in one envelope sometimes, making it difficult to discover who is the proper person to return them to. Again, there are letters with postage stamps to be returned, and money letters containing not over $1. Those with larger amounts are directed in the superintendent's room. Ladies directing stamp and money letters keep account of them in a book, submitted together with the letters to the superintendent at the close of office hours every day. Money letters are marked with red stars, stamp letters with blue. Stamps taken from dead letters are destroyed by the proper authorities. Then there is copying to do, orders and circulars, rules and regulations, to be transmitted to the different local post offices, and translations to be made of communications received from foreign post departments. All this is special work. A large proportion of the letters passing through the office are German letters. Some French, Italian, Norwegian, and Spanish, but 2 German clerks are constantly employed, while 1 clerk can easily attend to the letters of all the other nationalities together. Sometimes it comes to pass that the superintendent visits one room or the other, with a number of letters in his hand. These have been misdirected or badly written. The red letter stamped on each letter guides him to the desk of the lady who has directed it, and very sensitive is each and every lady to the slightest reproach or reprimand received, because of the universal kindness and respect with which they are treated by all the officials with whom they come in contact. If the task of poring over these epistles of all kinds day after day is on the whole tiresome and wearing, there are certain many incidents to relieve the tedium of the occupation. Incidents, I say, letters, I should say. The deep respect we entertain for a well-known army officer was justified to me by the insight his own letters gave me into his character. It is against the rules of the Post Office Department to read any part of a letter unless it is necessary to do so in order to discover the correct address of the writer. But as the General's handwriting is a little hasty and peculiar, and his military honors and titles were not appended to those letters I speak of, it was natural that they should be read by the clerks in order to ascertain whether they could be returned to the place they were written from. One of these letters had been written to an old lady, I judged so from the fact of his inquiring about her son and grandchildren, somewhere in the South, who, it appeared, had entertained the General at her house one day during the war, when the General was very much in want of a dinner to eat. He had not forgotten her kindness and hospitality, though it was now after the close of the war, but the old lady had probably removed from the little village to which the letter was directed, or perhaps she had died, so the letter came into our hands and was returned to the General. Another was to an old friend of the General's. They had played together as boys, perhaps, but his friend had not risen to fame and fortune like himself. He was giving words to his deep sympathy with a misfortune or bereavement that had befallen his friend, sympathy expressed with such tender, true feeling that we felt as though it were another bereavement that he should have lost this letter of the General's. The remark was often made among us that the Dead Letter Office afforded the very best opportunities for making collections of autographs of celebrated people. Only the authorities could not be made to see it in that light. It was always with a sigh of regret, I must confess, that letters signed by such names as Bancroft, Whittier, Beecher, Grant, Greeley were returned to their rightful owners. The most interesting accounts of foreign travel were sometimes contained in the dead letters, accounts more interesting than any book ever published. These were, as a general thing, written by ladies, and that sealed their doom. Gentlemen writing letters almost always sign their full name, but a lady will write a dozen pages telling her friends all about the Louvre and the Tuileries, the Escurial and London Tower in one long letter, and then sign Kate or Lily at the end, thus precluding all possibility of having her letter returned, though we know from it that she is returned to her home in Boston. It is almost incredible what a large number of letters passing through our hands are finished off by that classically beautiful verse, "My pen is bad, my ink is pale, my love for you will never fail," and it is impossible to believe in how many different ways and styles these touching lines can be written and spelled, till you find them dished up to you a dozen times a day in this office. Eastern people don't appreciate this poem as Western farmers do. Missouri rustics are particularly addicted to it. What the predilection of the Southern people might have been I cannot say. It was just after the close of the war, and their letters were pitiful enough. Of course, there was not a federal postage stamp to be had in any of the Southern states, and no matter how deeply the contents of some of these letters affected us, we could not forward them to the people they were addressed to. These letters from the South portrayed so terribly true the bitter, abject poverty of all classes at that time, that the Northerners to whom they were written would not have hesitated to assist these friends of better days, could they have received the letters, but, even had we been allowed to forward them, the chances were extremely slender that people were still in the same position and location after the war as before the war. Not these letters alone were sad, for sometimes a whole drama could be read from one or two short letters. One day we found among the dead letters a note written in a feeble, scrawling hand. It was by a boy, a prisoner and sick in one of the penal institutions of New York, sick, poor fellow, and imploring his mother oh so piteously to come and see him. He was in the sick ward, he said, and if he had been wicked, and had struck at his stepfather when he saw him abuse his mother, would she not come to see him only once for all that? She must not let his stepfather prevent her from coming. He was dreaming of his mother and sister every night, and he knew his mother would come to him. But she must come soon, for the doctor had said so. Perhaps the letter had not reached the mother because the stepfather had taken her out of the son's reach, for in the course of a day or two we found another letter addressed to the same woman by one of the prison officials. The boy Charlie had died on such a date, about a week after his letter had been written, and he had looked and asked for his mother to the last. About letters written by German people I have noticed one peculiarity. They never omit to write the number of the year in some part of the letter or on the envelope outside. Sometimes it is written where the name of the country or the state should be found on the envelope, so that the direction would read Jacob Schmid, St. Louis, 1865, or they write it at the bottom of the letter instead of signing their name, and then write their name at the beginning of the letter, as though they are writing the letter to themselves. Everything is heavy and clumsy about their letters. They never indulge in joke or sentiment, and through the negligence of one of the German clerks, the most serious trouble had almost been brewed in a German brewer's family at one time. It happened this way. A substantial German brewer had written to Hans Biersoffel, dunning him for money owing on several barrels of lager. Hans must have left the city. At any rate, the letter came to our office, and was returned to the brewer. But unfortunately, a very sentimental letter, containing a copy of some lovesick verses written by a German lady, and held in the office as a curiosity for a little while, had, by mistake of course, found its way into this letter. The honest Dutchman had meant to return this piece of property to our office at the first opportunity, and therefore carried it in his pocket-book, where his wife discovered it, seized it, and held it over his head as the sword of Damocles for ever after, as he could not prove to her satisfaction that the letter and verses had not been sent to him by the writer. At the time I belonged to the corps of dead-letter clerks. There were 3 rooms fronting on 7th Street, fitted up as offices for the lady clerks, and one very large room on the other side of the hall. A straw mat was spread on the stone floor in our room. One office chair was furnished for each lady, and desks barely large enough for 2 ladies to work at without elbowing each other, and in one corner washstand and water. In the large room some 20 ladies were writing, while 4 or 5 folders had their desk in the same room. Of the other rooms, one was occupied by the lady superintendent, together with whom were from 4 to 6 ladies. The next room also accommodated 6 ladies, and the last one, which had the look of a prison from a high grating running through it, afforded room for 4 others. There were old post office directories, boxes containing printed matter, and such like valuables kept behind this grating. And one day, when a party of sightseers came unasked into our room, the youngest lady there, whose spirit had not yet been broken by the weight of the responsibilities resting on her shoulders, explained to the gaping crowd that behind this grating were kept the silver and household furniture of General , the assistant postmaster, boxed up while he was recruiting in the country. This was a 2-fold revenge, the young lady said to us. It was punishing the visitors for their inquisitiveness, and old for having the grating put up there. Several years have passed since I last saw the post office building. The ladies of room number were then petitioning to have this grating removed. Whether their petition was granted, I have not learned. End of Down Among the Dead Letters by Josephine Clifford. Read by Colleen McMahon.
Effects of Situation, Climate, Tendance by Theophrastus, 371 to 287 BC. From Inquiry into Plants and Minor Works on Odors and Weather Signs, with an English translation by Sir Arthur Hort. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Effects of Situation, Climate, Tendance. Again, differences in situation and climate affect the result. In some places, such as Philippi, the soil seems to produce plants which resemble their parent. On the other hand, a few kinds in some few places seem to undergo a change, so that wild seed gives a cultivated form, or a poor form, one actually better. We have heard that this occurs, but only with the pomegranate in Egypt and Cilicia. In Egypt, a tree of the acid kind, both from seeds and from cuttings, produces one whose fruit has a sort of sweet taste, while about Soli in Cilicia, near the river Pinarus, where the battle with Darius was fought, all those pomegranates raised from seed are without stones. If any one were to plant our palm at Babylon, it is reasonable to expect that it would become fruitful and like the palms of that country. And so would it be with any other country which has fruits that are congenial to that particular locality. For the locality is more important than cultivation and tendance. A proof of this is the fact that things transplanted thence become unfruitful, and in some cases refuse to grow altogether. There are also modifications due to feeding and attention of other kinds, which cause the wild to become cultivated, or again cause some cultivated kind to go wild, such as pomegranate and almond. Some say that wheat has been known to be produced from barley, and barley from wheat, or again both growing on the same stool, but these accounts should be taken as fabulous. Anyhow, those things which do change in this manner do so spontaneously, and the alteration is due to a change of position, as we said happens with pomegranates in Egypt and Cilicia, and not to any particular method of cultivation. So too is it when fruit-bearing trees become unfruitful. For instance, the Persian when moved from Egypt, the date palm when planted in Hellas, or the tree which is called poplar in Crete, if any one should transplant it. Some again say that the sorb becomes unfruitful if it comes into a very warm position, since it is by nature cold-loving. It is reasonable to suppose that both results follow because the natural circumstances are reversed, seeing that some things entirely refuse to grow when their place is changed. Such are the modifications due to position. As to those due to method of culture, the changes which occur in things grown from seed are as was said, for with things so grown also the changes are of all kinds. Under cultivation, the pomegranate and the almond change character. The pomegranate, if it receives pig manure and a great deal of river water; the almond, if one inserts a peg and removes for some time the gum which exudes and gives the other attention required. In like manner, plainly, some wild things become cultivated, and some cultivated things become wild. For the one kind of change is due to cultivation, the other to neglect. However, it might be said that this is not a change, but a natural development towards a better or an inferior form. For that it is not possible to make a wild olive, pear, or fig into a cultivated olive, pear, or fig. As to that, indeed, which is said to occur in the case of the wild olive, that if the tree is transplanted with its top growth entirely cut off, it produces coarse olives. This is no very great change. However, it can make no difference which way one takes this. End of Effects of Situation, Climate, Tendence by Theophrastus, 371 to 287 B.C. From Inquiry into Plants and Minor Works on Odors and Weather Signs with an English Translation by Sir Arthur Hort.
Qualities and Properties of Grapevines and Wines. From The American Manual of the Grapevines and the Art of Making Wine by Constantine Samuel Rafinesque, 1830. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Every part of these useful vines is valuable and available. The countries where they are a staple boast of being blessed above all others and are envied by their neighbors. The ancient nations have cultivated them from the most remote antiquity, and ascribed their introduction to primitive legislators and benefactors. The Hindus, Persians, Armenians, Arabs, and Jews to Nahusha or Noah. The Greeks said that Bacchus carried them from Asia to Greece and India, Saturn to Crete, Orestes, son of Deucalion, to Sicily, Osiris to Egypt, Janus to Italy, Geryon to Spain, etc. Their various uses were known very early, and many wines made at very early periods. Vines live from 100 to 500 years. When allowed full scope, their roots and stems become very large, sometimes several feet in circumference. The bark is used for straps, ropes, baskets, mats, etc. The wood of the root and stem is very hard and has a fine grain. It resembles walnut and cypress, is employed to make tables, doors, implements, etc., which are very durable. It is too valuable for burning when large. The branches and twigs are chiefly used for burning, and faggots made with them after trimming the vines, much used in vine countries for ovens, to light fires and cook, etc. In the spring the vernal sap of the vines is similar to water and very cooling. The leaves are used for many purposes: to carry fruits, butter, and saleables to market, to cover, clean, scour, etc. Cattle are fond of them. They are given to cows, goats, and hogs. They form one of the best manures for the vines themselves. A kind of wine may be made of them with sugar. The blossoms of the fragrant kinds are used as perfume, and to give this perfume to wine, being put in when fermenting. From the grapes are made 1. Verjuice, 2. Must, 3. Syrup, 4. Grape butter, 5. Sugar, 6. Wines, 7. Boiled wines, 8. Nectar, 9. Piquet, 10. Lees, 11. Vinegar, 12. Brandy, 13. Alcohol, 14. Varnish, 15. Preserves, 16. Pies and tarts, 17. Raisins, 18. Tartar or argol, 19. Cordials, 20. Perfumes, etc. And they are one of the most palatable and healthy fruit of the table, of which there is a succession from the end of June to November. They may even be preserved fresh the whole winter in sawdust, and are thus exported. The seeds of grapes are eaten by fowls, pigeons, and birds. They are astringent and oily. A fine fixed oil is made from them by pressure in Parma, Lombardy, and other parts of Italy, similar to olive oil, and used for burning and frying. The husks and peduncles are a valuable manure. When burnt they make the best potash used for soft soap. Argol or tartar is extracted from the lees or settlings of wine, and is incrusted in the vats and casks. Burned lees are called wine ashes. From argol are made tartaric acid and cream of tartar. Acetic acid is made from vinegar. Verjuice is the juice of unripe grapes, and chiefly of the verjuice grapes, which never ripen. It is acid and harsh, containing malic acid, tartrate of potash, and extractive. It is used as a condiment, like vinegar and lime juice. It is cooling and laxative. A peculiar wine can be made of it by the addition of sugar, which resembles fine cider or champagne, according to the mode of fermenting. Ripe grapes contain 1. Tartaric acid, 2. Sugar, 3. Water, and 4. Mucilage in different proportion, according to the kinds. These are the essential elements of wine before fermentation. The adventitious elements are 1. Malic acid, 2. Carbonic acid, 3. Potash, 4. Tannin, 5. Aroma, 6. Coloring principle, which are not always present except tannin, which is always found in the husk or skin, as well as the peduncles and seeds of the grapes. Ripe grapes are cooling, antiseptic, and nutritious. When eaten in large quantities they become diuretic, laxative, and pectoral. They form an excellent diet in all inflammatory diseases, incipient thiasis, phlegmasis, convalescence from fevers, etc. The sweetest and well-flavored kinds are the best. All the harsh and bad-tasted are only fit to make wine. It is with grapes as with apples. The best for the table do not always make the best wine or cider. Among American grapes, out of 40 species, we have only 17 suitable to make good wine, and among these only 8 very palatable, such as the Bland, Alexander, Scuppernong, Muscadine, Elsenburg, Owisburg River and Maple grapes with their varieties. Raisins are the dried grapes, which is commonly done by scalding the bunches in boiling water with ashes, which shrivels them, and next hanging them on strings to dry in the shade. A few are dried in the sun in very warm countries. These operations dissipate the water of the grapes. They diminish the acid and increase the sugar, which often crystallizes spontaneously in them. Raisins are less cooling than grapes, nay, eaten in quantity they are heating and flatulent. Boiled raisins are almost restored to the primitive state of grapes. They become very emollient, pectoral, and laxative. We could make raisins in America with most of the 8 kinds mentioned above as palatable, and also with some of the large fox grapes. Many culinary preparations are made with fresh grapes and raisins, such as pies, tarts, plum puddings, dumplings, preserves, jellies, etc. In America we use for pies and tarts almost all the kinds except the bitter sort, and even the smallest chicken and pigeon grapes. They improve and enlarge by cooking. Grape butter is made like apple butter by boiling the must or juice of the grapes to the consistency of honey. It is much used in Europe and Asia. The French call it raisinette, and the best is made sweeter and granular by the addition of sugar, and is then one of the greatest delicacies. We could easily make it with our grapes. The unboiled and unfermented must, or recent juice, is used as a pleasant and cooling beverage with water and sugar all over the Oriental countries. It is called sherbet, and much liked by the Mohammedans, who are forbid the use of wine. Several kinds are made by the addition of raisins, cinnamon, rose water, spices, and other ingredients. The best is cooled with snow. Syrup and sugar can be made from must and raisins. The must of sweet grapes give a syrup by condensation or evaporation, which prevents fermentation, and raisins boiled to a pulp and strained give the same. This syrup has the flavor of the grape, and may be used like any other syrup. From it sugar is made by chemical operations, concentration, saturation, separation of water, granulation, etc. The grape sugar is peculiar. It never crystallizes perfectly, commonly forms lumps, and is difficult to bleach it, but it makes very good and sweet coarse sugar. In Europe the manufacture has been tried on a large scale, but chiefly in France, where the grapes are not so saccharine as in Spain, and the preference has been given to the better and whiter home sugar of beets and chestnuts. But wine is the chief and most useful produce of the grape. It is the juice of the grape altered by the vinous fermentation. There are innumerable kinds of wines produced by the various grapes, their mixture, climate and soil, cultivation and manipulation, care and skill. Perhaps 3,000 kinds, of which 500 in France, 700 in Italy, 600 in Spain and Portugal, 100 in Germany and Hungary, 300 in Greece and Turkey, 100 in Persia, 200 in Tibet and China, 150 in Egypt and Barbary, 30 in South Africa, 50 in the Atlantic Islands, 60 in North America, 40 in South America, but several of these differ little from each other. And of Qualities and Properties of Grapevines and Wines, from American Manual of the Grapevines and the Art of Making Wine, by Constantine Samuel Rafinesque, 1830. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
Immanuel Kant and John George Hamann, from the Life of Immanuel Kant, by John Henry Wilbrandt Stuckenberg, 1835 to 1903. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Among the literary men in Königsberg with whom Kant associated, John George Hamann was by far the most eminent. Our interest in him is the greater because we are indebted to him for many important hints respecting the philosopher and his labors. The rank assigned to him in literature is indicated by an article which appeared in 1853 in a journal published in Königsberg, where both he and Kant were born and where they lived and died. It speaks of Hamann's fame as promising to surpass that of the critical philosopher, although during their lives Kant was famous and the magician of the North, as Hamann was called, was obscure and neglected. Verily, while Kant's activity almost lies closed behind us, the present judges otherwise respecting the magician of the North, who is now honored as one of the greatest and deepest thinkers of the last century. But since this was written, the revival of interest in Kant has again exalted him, and has opened a new and important activity for his philosophy, and promises for it great things in the future. And there can be no question that in intellectual greatness, especially in speculation, he was far superior to his literary friend. Hamann is, however, now receiving some of the merited recognition which his own age refused him, and his words have a prophetic ring. One easily overcomes the double grief of being misunderstood and therefore abused by his own age, by cherishing confidence in the abilities of a better coming generation. Hamann was 6 years Kant's junior, and died 16 years earlier than the philosopher. Having completed his studies in his native city, he became a family tutor, and afterwards went to London on business for a firm in Riga, but was wholly unsuccessful. Becoming dissipated, he spent money entrusted to him by the firm, and became indebted to them to the amount of £300 sterling. When on the verge of despair, he read the Bible and professed to have been converted, by means of a descent to the hell of a knowledge of self. He wrote an autobiographical sketch of his experience in London, giving a minute account of his career in that city, and presented it to one of his employers in Riga, at the same time asking for the hand of his sister in marriage. The man was shocked by the perusal of this confession, and as its author still continued the course of idleness into which he had fallen, his request was refused. The sketch created such aversion to him that the firm felt inclined to have him imprisoned for having wasted their money. After visiting Riga, Hamann went to Königsberg, and Mr. Behrens, a member of the firm, also went to that city. This gentleman became intimate with Kant, and the two tried to rescue Hamann from the gloom which had settled upon him, and to induce him to work and form regular habits of industry. Not only was he melancholy and shiftless, idle and restless, but he also insisted on continuing in his idleness, and on letting his mind brood or revel as it pleased. Their efforts to induce him to change his mode of life incensed him, and to lead them to desist he wrote his Socratic Memorabilia, in which Kant and Behrens are represented as sustaining to him the relation of Alcibiades to Socrates. In this little book he claims that he must go his own way, guided by the word in his heart, which is the light of the gospel. Hamann warmly defends himself, and it is evident that, on account of his religion, he regards himself as superior to Kant, whom he does not think devout enough. When this book appeared, Kant was 35 years old, and had been a tutor in the university for 4 years. Lindner, a mutual friend in Riga, interposed to restore harmony. The firm forgave the debt, and in spite of Hamann's passionate words in his book, he and Kant remained on friendly terms. In some respects they were antipodes. The metaphysician was cold, logical, systematic, and severely regular. Hamann was passionate and imaginative, a creature of moods and impulses. Kant made reason the rule of his life and the source of his philosophy. Hamann found the source of both in his heart. While Kant dreaded enthusiasm in religion and suspected in it superstition and fanaticism, Hamann reveled in enthusiasm, and he believed in revelation, miracles, and worship, differing also in these points from the philosopher. In some respects they complemented each other, but the repelling elements were too strong to make them fully sympathetic. The difference in their standpoints, however, makes Hamann's views of Kant all the more interesting. In the course of time, Hamann secured employment as a secretary in the government office, but business was irksome to him, and literature largely absorbed his attention. Following the bent of his own mind, while at the university, he had spent his time there chiefly in studying the Humanities, instead of preparing for the ministry, as his father desired, or of studying law, though inscribed as a juridical student. After settling down in Königsberg, he devoted himself to theology, philosophy, ancient literature, oriental languages, and desultory reading. He was a voracious reader, the ancient classics, the English authors being among his favorites. His mind was receptive and creative, and was easily aroused. His imagination was vivid, his heart passionate. While not the man to treat a subject exhaustively or systematically, he was original and had genius. Gifted with a keen prophetic insight and remarkable intuition, his writings are peculiar, rich in apothegms, dark sayings, and riddles. His style is his own, and the sententiousness, the real profundity, and the peculiar use of figures and symbols make his books obscure, and there are passages which he himself did not understand some time after they were written, but from the dark clouds lightning flashes give, as it were, revelations of nature, the heart, and divine things. Uniting in himself so much that is poetical, romantic, wild, and weird, he well deserved the regard of Kant, the high esteem in which Goethe and other literary men held him, and the name by which he is known in German literature, the magician of the North. Hamann, who frequently met Kant, had a profound admiration for his intellect, and appreciated the excellence of his heart, but he was not blind to his faults, and never became an advocate of his philosophy. Kant aided him in various ways, and permitted his son to hear his lectures without compensation. Hamann recognized his indebtedness, and was so anxious not to offend his benefactor that he hesitated to criticize his books as severely as he thought they deserved. He wrote to Herder, "Through kindness to my son, Kant has put me under obligation to him, so that I desire, as much as you, to avoid all unpleasantness. Aside from the old Adam in his books, he is really obliging, unselfish, and at heart a good and noble-minded man of talent and merit." They frequently discussed literary subjects. Both were more eager to talk than to listen, and as their differences were very marked, their disputes at times became quite warm. Both, however, loved the truth, and were sincere in their inquiries, and each respected the views of the other. Soon after the troubles with the firm in Riga, Kant and Hamann, who had both been family tutors, planned to write a book for children on physics. Hamann was no doubt better suited for such a task than Kant, being better able to enter into sympathy with children. For some reason the philosopher dropped the matter, and Hamann, with considerable passion, and in an imperious tone, wrote to him to reprove him for abandoning the project. He admits his learning, and recognizes him as a philosopher, but charges him with vanity and a lack of candor, probably hinting that if Kant aided in writing such a book as that contemplated, he would accomplish something more useful than he had yet done. He says, "It is easy to preach to scholars as it is to cheat honest people, nor is it a dangerous or responsible work, because most of them are already so perverted that a venturesome author cannot any more confuse their mode of thinking. Even the blind heathen has regard for children, and a baptized philosopher ought to know that, in order to write for children, more is required than the wit of Fontenelle and a coquettish style. One would injure children by that which petrifies beautiful spirits and inspires beautiful marble." Evidently regarding the philosopher as too far removed from the simple nature of children to adapt himself to their needs, he warns him that he who would write for them must have a knowledge of children, such as neither the gallant nor the academic world can give. This was said when Kant was as brilliant in society as in the lecture room. Hamann's severity is seen in the following: "The spirit of our book must be moral, but if we ourselves are not moral, how can we impart a moral spirit to our books, and communicate it to our readers? We should obtrude ourselves as blind leaders of the blind. Obtrude ourselves, I say, without a calling and without necessity." This is probably merely a hint that Kant was not frank towards Hamann in this matter. Kant did not reply to these insinuations and appeals, and the project of writing the book of which the philosopher seemed to think little, while Hamann regarded it as very important, was dropped. Their temperaments and standpoints made such conflicts unavoidable. The impulsive, unreserved magician could not put himself in the place of the self-possessed, critical philosopher. If Hamann was one-sided, was Kant less so? Were not the qualities which had been excessively developed by the one the very thing which the other had neglected? In later years Hamann dealt less passionately with his eminent friend, and frequently speaks of him with great praise. He indeed thought that the remarkable fame of the thinker had made him somewhat vain, but for this he blamed him less than the public. Once he exclaimed, "How long was this great man obliged to be a tutor in the university? How miserable was his condition as a student! But with what modesty he afterwards enjoyed his great triumphs." His conflicting views of Kant must be ascribed largely to the changes in his own variable moods. End of Immanuel Kant and John George Hamann. From the Life of Immanuel Kant, by John Henry Wilbrandt Stuckenberg, 1835 to 1903.
From Life of Benjamin Robert Hayden, Historical Painter, by Benjamin Robert Hayden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1817. In December, Wordsworth was in town, and as Keats wished to know him, I made up a party to dinner, of Charles Lamb, Wordsworth, Keats, and Monkhouse his friend, and a very pleasant party we had. I wrote to Lamb and told him the address was 22 Lisson Grove, North, at Rossi's, halfway up, right-hand corner. I received his characteristic reply: "My dear Hayden, I will come with pleasure to 22 Lisson Grove, North, at Rossi's, halfway up, right-hand side, if I can find it. Yours, C. Lamb, 20 Russell Court, Covent Garden East, halfway up, next the corner, left-hand side." On December 28th, the Immortal dinner came off in my painting room, with Jerusalem towering up behind us as a background. Wordsworth was in fine cue, and we had a glorious set to, on Homer, Shakespeare, Milton, and Virgil. Lamb got exceedingly merry, and exquisitely witty, and his fun in the midst of Wordsworth's solemn intonations of oratory was like the sarcasm and wit of the fool in the intervals of Lear's Passion. Lamb soon got delightfully merry. He made a speech and voted me absent, and made them drink my health. "Now," said Lamb, "you old lake poet, you rascally poet, why do you call Voltaire dull?" We all defended Wordsworth, and affirmed there was a state of mind when Voltaire would be dull. "Well," said Lamb, "here's Voltaire, the Messiah of the French nation, and a very proper one too." He then, in a strain of humour beyond description, abused me for putting Newton's head into my picture. A fellow, said he, who believed nothing unless it was as clear as the three sides of a triangle. And then he and Keats agreed he had destroyed all the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to the prismatic colors. It was impossible to resist him, and we all drank Newton's health and confusion to mathematics. It was delightful to see the good humour of Wordsworth in giving in to all our frolics without affectation, and laughing as heartily as the best of us. By this time other friends joined, among them poor Richie, who was going to penetrate by Fezzan to Timbuktu. I introduced him to all as a gentleman going to Africa. Lamb seemed to take no notice, but all of a sudden he roared out, "Which is the gentleman we are going to lose?" We then drank the victim's health, in which Richie joined. In the morning of this delightful day, a gentleman, a perfect stranger, had called on me. He said he knew my friends, had an enthusiasm for Wordsworth, and begged I would procure him the happiness of an introduction. He told me he was a comptroller of stamps, and often had correspondence with the poet. I thought it a liberty, but still, as he seemed a gentleman, I told him he might come. When we retired to tea, we found the comptroller. In introducing him to Wordsworth, I forgot to say who he was. After a little time, the comptroller looked down, looked up, and said to Wordsworth, "Don't you think, sir, Milton was a great genius?" Keats looked at me, Wordsworth looked at the comptroller. Lamb, who was dozing by the fire, turned round and said, "Pray, sir, did you say Milton was a great genius?" "No, sir, I asked Mr. Wordsworth if he were not." "Oh," said Lamb, "then you are a silly fellow." "Charles, my dear Charles," said Wordsworth. But Lamb, perfectly innocent of the confusion he had created, was off again by the fire. After an awful pause, the comptroller said, "Don't you think Newton a great genius?" I could not stand it any longer. Keats put his head into my books. Richie squeezed in a laugh. Wordsworth seemed asking himself, "Who is this?" Lamb got up, and taking a candle, said, "Sir, will you allow me to look at your phrenological development?" He then turned his back on the poor man, and at every question of the comptroller he chanted, "Diddle diddle dumpling, my son John went to bed with his breeches on." The man in office, finding Wordsworth did not know who he was, said, in a spasmodic and half-chuckling anticipation of assured victory, "I have had the honour of some correspondence with you, Mr. Wordsworth." "With me, sir," said Wordsworth, "not that I remember." "Don't you, sir? I am a comptroller of stamps." There was a dead silence, the comptroller evidently thinking that was enough. While we were waiting for Wordsworth's reply, Lamb sung out, "Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle." "My dear Charles," said Wordsworth. "Diddle diddle dumpling, my son John," chanted Lamb. And then rising, exclaimed, "Do let me have another look at that gentleman's organs." Keats and I hurried Lamb into the painting room, shut the door, and gave way to inextinguishable laughter. Monkhouse followed, and tried to get Lamb away. We went back, but the comptroller was irreconcilable. We soothed and smiled, and asked him to supper. He stayed, though his dignity was sorely affected. However, being a good-natured man, we parted all in good humour, and no ill effects followed. All the while, until Monkhouse succeeded, we could hear Lamb struggling in the painting-room, and calling at intervals, "Who is that fellow? Allow me to see his organs once more." It was, indeed, an immortal evening. Wordsworth's fine intonation as he quoted Milton and Virgil, Keats' eager, inspired look, Lamb's quaint sparkle of lambent humour, so speeded the stream of conversation that in my life I never passed a more delightful time. All our fun was within bounds, not a word passed that an apostle might not have listened to. It was a night worthy of the Elizabethan age, and my solemn Jerusalem flashing up by the flame of the fire, with Christ hanging over us like a vision, all made up a picture which will long glow upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude. Keats made Ritchie promise he would carry his Endymion to the great desert of Sahara and fling it in the midst. Poor Ritchie went to Africa and died, as Lamb foresaw in 1819. Keats died in 1821 at Rome. C. Lamb is gone, joking to the last. Monkhouse is dead. And Wordsworth and I are the only two now living, 1841, of that glorious party. Recording by Eva Davis. End of Life of Benjamin Robert Hayden, Historical Painter, by Benjamin Robert Hayden.